Welcome to the debrief for the first debate on BE 101X. Let me start off by recapping the topic for the first debate, which was the topic on irrationality and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. The question that was posed was, is irrationality truly damaging to welfare? We had 7 experts who gave their comments on that topic. We had Professor Catherine Young from the National University of Singapore, Professor Nina Majar, who is my colleague here at Toronto, and Professor Sendil Mullainathan from Harvard, all 3 of whom said yes, it is damaging to welfare. Professor Chris Shih from the University of Chicago responded with both a yes and a no, and we'll get into some more details on his response a little bit later. And then we had 3 people, Spike Lee, who was my colleague here at the University of Toronto, Shankar Vedantam, who is the author of The Hidden Brain, and Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy UK and Ogilvy Change, who all said no, that irrationality was not damaging to welfare. Now, if you look at the entire spectrum of views, there was a fairly equal split in terms of the verdict. So 3 people said yes, 3 people said no, 1 person was right on the fence. But if you think through the comments that they gave, if you think through the reasons that they gave, there was a fair bit of consistency in the underlying debate, in the underlying discussion that they each provided. So as both our experts said in their commentary, as well as a lot of the comments that we read, the answer to the question seemed to revolve around a bigger question, which is how do we define irrationality? And in particular, there were 2 sets of definitions that came forth. The first was the definition that some of the early researchers in the judgment and decision-making tradition used, and that was a deviation from the norms, from the axioms of expected utility theory. We talked about all these axioms, and if your behavior was different from those axioms, if you did something that was different from what economic theory said you should do, you were irrational. And that's one form of irrationality. But then we had Professor Chris Shih and Shankar and a few others who came in and said, well, there's a different flavor of irrationality, and that's the one that might be more damaging. And what is that? That is the gap between what people want to do and what they actually end up doing. We want to save more, but we don't end up doing that. We want to exercise more, and we don't do that. And that's the gap that a lot of people thought was irrational. And if you think about it, there are 2 forms, therefore, of irrationality. There's a strong form, which is every individual not doing what they want to do. And then there's a weaker form, which is you don't do what economics tells you to do. The second form, the weak form, the feeling that some of our panelists and some of you had was, who cares? Who cares if, in fact, people don't behave according to the laws of economics? And an interesting thought there is, if you don't behave according to the laws of economics, does that make you irrational? I'd make the argument that the irrationality is on the other side. You are just being human. It's the laws that don't apply. And so believing that the laws of economics applies to human behavior is perhaps another form of irrationality. But that happens a lot. So when you think about managers who expect that people will be swayed by certain pieces of information, do so because they expect others to be rational. Or stock markets expect investors to be rational. Or people who disclose lots of information to you in the hopes that you will make a better decision expect you to be rational. And so the expectation that other people are going to use information or behave according to the laws of economics is in itself a form of irrationality. There were 2 other interesting comments that I want to highlight. One that was made by both Rory as well as Shankar, and that had to do with the benefits of irrationality. Both of them actually spoke to the fact that being irrational might actually be a good thing. So for example, Shankar talked about the fact that when you're in a plane and there's turbulence, it is irrational to be worried about it because these things happen. Or it is irrational to be worried about crossing a street because the probability of you getting hit by a car is very low. Or it is irrational to worry about traffic accidents and many, many other things that are actually low in probability. But again, irrational from an economic standpoint. But if we truly didn't care about these things, we wouldn't be in a position to design safeguards. If we didn't care about turbulence, our planes would not be as safe as they are. If we didn't care about crossing the street, our culture in terms of how we cross the street and our traffic regulations wouldn't be as stringent as they are. Being irrational and fearfully so allows us to design better procedures to deal with a lot of these everyday situations. A second interesting comment was sort of emergent from the themes that we saw on the web pages, on the discussion boards, as well as from the comments of our panelists, is if you were truly economically rational, you probably have a very sad life. Because to be economically rational, you have to care about utility, you are thinking about the lowest price, you are processing lots of information, and you probably will be successful at doing all of that, but at what cost? And that was also the theme that Professor Spike Lee raised in his debate, where he said, what is the metric for actually assessing the outcome? When we talk about welfare, what do we mean? Do we mean people's bank balances? Do we mean how happy they are? And indeed, if happiness is what we're trying to pursue, then perhaps the economic definition of rationality doesn't really matter. And finally, one last comment. When we think about the deviation between what people should be doing and what they actually do, who decides what they should actually be doing? Is it a government? Is it a marketer? Or is it themselves? And as we go through this course, we'll talk about different forms of discrepancies between what people should be doing and what they actually do.